Damon just asked me to make an introduction for the recording.
Oh,
So
okay, go
for
for it.
all of you who haven't been here before, we are recording. And I think this is November 7th.
Sixth.
Sixth. This is November 6th. And we're going to start a 3-part series today. Thanks to Polly Deppen-Williams. Thank you very much for coming. And the title is What Has Been and What Shall Be.
Ooh.
I love that. The Once and Future Church. So there's a lot to talk about in November about what has been and what shall be. And I'm thinking I saw a map up there, so we'll get to see and where.
Yes, yes.
And that'll be very, very nice.
Yeah,
Thank you.
absolutely. So I'm glad to be here this morning. And what I want to do to start out with is just talk a little bit about our presbytery, because that really sets the stage for what I'm seeing changes in the church. This summer I celebrated 30 years of ordained ministry. And the church I was ordained into in 1992 is very different in many, many ways than the church of 2022. So I'm going to talk a little bit about those things. So don't hesitate to throw out questions, any clarifications, things like that. So well, good morning. Let's see. There. Okay, so I wanted to put the map of our synod on here. And as you can see, our synod, it's a huge synod, Synod of Lakes and Prairies. And here we are down here, Presbytery, Central Nebraska Presbytery. And just to let you know, we have 36 churches. We're over a 46 county area, 21 contain PCUSA churches. It's 32,500 square miles. Right now we have about 3,052 members, that's our official count right now. And we go from Valentine over to O'Neill, down to Superior, and over to Benkelman. That gives you sort of an idea. It's a big chunk. Right next to us is Homestead Presbytery, which is Lincoln, and then there's Presbytery, Missouri River Valley, which gets Omaha. So I really think eventually these boundaries are going to be changing. They're going to have to, just with numbers and things like that. So, but yeah, you can see the synod here. It's all upper Midwest churches, mostly rural in our synod. Ilona Street Stewart is our synod executive. She was moderator of the General Assembly in the past term. So I guess, Brian, that would have been when you were she was elected when you were one of the commissioners. So currently we have 15 ministers of Word and Sacrament. That's what I am. That's what Greg is. And you'll see then we have 3 pastors of other denominations, which includes Damon, because Damon is United Church of Christ. We have 9 commission pastors, which a commission pastor is someone who has not gone to seminary, but is a ruling elder and has taken courses that are sort of a mini seminary kind of training. So we do a lot of our training through Dubuque Seminary, but there's also been something called ELM, Educating Lay Ministry. Yes, it was a combination of like Disciples, Lutheran. It was a big group. That doesn't really happen much anymore. So we send folks to Dubuque because their program is online. But a lot of seminaries. Good morning.
Morning, sorry.
Oh, don't be sorry. It's okay. Good to see you. So we have 9 commissioned pastors. Then we have 2 commissioned pastors from other denominations. I'll talk about that. And then we have 1. These are all serving churches. We have 1 other I can mention. It's just somebody serving a church who doesn't fall into those categories. So I'm also the stated clerk, so I have to keep track of all those, like Greg's a 101, so we have all these different codes for what everybody is, of course. So we also have 5 ministers of Word and Sacrament serving in validated ministries. One of them's me. David McCarthy is considered in that category. Doodle Harris is in that category. We have 5 members at large. That's ministers of Word and Sacrament that are not in a church right now. Sometimes one of our pastors, it's because she went back to California to take care of her mom as she was in the dying process. So, it just gives them some time to keep their ordination and then be doing other things at the time. And then we have 10 honorably retired ministers of Word and Sacrament. So, and even our retired ones, like Bill Nottage Tacey, we roped him back in. So that doesn't always mean that, so he's not counted in that currently serving congregations. So, okay, there it is. It's been a while since I've used PowerPoint. So, okay, so some of this, we have 36 churches. The reason I'm telling you this is just to show you how one of the things that church is now is you have to be creative. It's no longer, like I said, it's no longer the church I was ordained into 30 years ago. When I was ordained, I became an associate pastor. And my first three calls were being an associate. That is not normal anymore. It's hard for seminary students to graduate and go into an associate position, and then you move, you'd sort of move up kind of thing. I was being a career associate for a while, and my EP said to me, Polly, just stop it. Go be a solo pastor. And I said, okay. And I moved to Nebraska. So we have two churches with more than one full-time pastor. One is this church, and one is Grand Island. The reason I included that is they're getting ready to search for an associate pastor. So we will have two churches that have more than one pastor. 7 churches with a full-time minister of Word and Sacrament. 3 with a part-time minister of Word and Sacrament. 6 churches sharing pastoral leadership with either PCUSA or other denominations. Okay. 3 with a full-time commission pastor. 11 with a part-time commission pastor. 1 with part-time leadership other. That's what I mentioned. It's our pastor in Sutherland. He doesn't fall into any of those categories, but he's had some lay pastor training. And then we have 3 churches with no pastoral leadership. We actually right now have no churches actively looking for pastors, which when I tell my colleagues that, they're very envious and they don't want to talk to me because everybody's searching. It's just we happen to fill pulpits faster than a lot of other places right now. That doesn't mean, because I have one that's thinking about retirement. So, those things, it changes very quickly, as it does in any job. So, so one of the big things about church right now is I did not expect to be working with my colleagues in mid-council ministry. Mid-council ministry is what they call Presbyterian level, or it would be like the district level in the United Methodist Church, the Synod, and the Lutheran Church. I am now getting together with the bishops and other folks that work at that level to try to fill churches. We see what we can do. I think that's going to become more common. And so a lot of this, I show you just to see the creativity that has to enter into church work from my position. This is opposed to someone who is a pastor in a congregation. So right now we have Fullerton Community Church, which is a combination PCUSA United Methodist Church, and they just called Pastor Joy Church is her name. Isn't that perfect? Reverend Joy Church. We also have First Presbyterian Church in Superior and Bethany Lutheran in Ruskin, which is pastored by an ELCA pastor, Lori Kitzing. So that's 2 part-time churches that could work together to have a full-time pastor. And they're close enough. So then we also have, well, I listed Damon being with the UCC here. So also we have Heartland Shared Ministries. Church of the Plains, which is PCUSA and Edgar, Clay Center UCC, and then Salem Lutheran in Superior, they have an ELCA pastor, Ethan Feisner. So again, and Lori and Ethan, while they are serving Presbyterian churches, are temporarily Presbyterian. We have this thing called a formula of agreement. And we have that with the Lutheran Church, the Reformed Church in America, the UCC, the Moravians, and I think that's about it. And we have reciprocity, where we can easily walk into, I can walk in and serve a Lutheran church, they can serve us without any hassle. We're trying to get that worked out with the Episcopal Church. A little tougher because they have bishops. Lutherans have bishops, but it's not bishops the same way that the ELCA has bishops. And we don't have that combination, that reciprocity as easily with the Methodist Church, although we have, like a Methodist Presbyterian combo church. So, and then you can see here, we have, in Ewing, we have a United Methodist Church lay pastor. In North Platte, we have a parish ministry associate. She's like a commissioned pastor in the ELCA. And then in Aurora, we have a lay pastor with the Disciples of Christ. So Presbyterian churches are not just all filled by Presbyterians. And I think the one thing about, which we'll get to a little bit, is in rural ministry, we're having to be creative. One of the things that I talk with the other mid-council, or judicatory is the other word that you'll hear thrown around, which is that upper level of church government, it's the fancy word, is that, for example, 2 Sundays from today, I'm going to Benkelman to preach. If you've ever been to Benkelman, it's about 600 in the village of Benkelman, very small. This church has about 14 members, 4 of which are sisters, the oldest of which is 105. She still drives. So those 4 sisters, I think, are holding that church. The youngest is like 90, I think. They aren't even meeting in their sanctuary anymore. They meet downstairs in their fellowship hall. When my husband goes with me, he doubles the male attendance. There's 1 guy, so Matt makes 2. And that's a church that in that town, there's a Methodist church, there's a Baptist church. They probably wouldn't be but then there's also, I'm trying to think if it's Lutheran there's Methodist. Eventually, I wonder if that town is going to have to go to one community mainline denomination church. That makes the most sense.
Right.
The point is how, talking like this group of people, like I think of my ladies at Benkelman, and I say ladies because there's 1 guy, talking them out of being a church is tough. But eventually, we're going to have to figure out what to do with that church, because I go out there quarterly, but, it's tough. So we have,
Isn't the big stumbling block, though, they don't want to give up their buildings?
Yes.
They all recognize, hey, we only have 12 in worship service.
Yes.
Worship service, we're feeding this. But, let the Presbyterians come to us. We're not going to go to them. I've seen that played out.
Yeah.
Small town after small town.
Exactly. And I think it's really going to have to return to that community church kind of thing where, really when it comes to some of the traditions, it's very close, unless you start to get into the minutia of theology and polity, those kind of things, which not every church member really would get into. It just seems like that's going to have to be, especially in these little towns. They just can't support a church the way they used to, especially, I've looked at ways of trying to get like one, because you could get 1 full-time pastor in that community and have all these churches support, but trying to get them all to come together because they all want to be buried in their own church. They all want, some of this I think might be a generational thing, that when a certain generation in some of these small communities is no longer with us, not to deny the wonderful things that they did, but I think it's going to have to take some time to have that change. But I wonder what in the heck we're going to do as a presbytery with a church and a manse in Benkelman. So, because if it closes, it's their church, but the presbytery holds, it's that weird combination of it's held in trust by the church. It's that whole combination of Presbyterian polity and property. So rural ministry, I think, has some blessings. The church is still at the center of a lot of people's lives. A lot of our communities still have it that Wednesdays they don't plan activities. I don't know if that's the same way in Hastings anymore.
It's close.
It's close?
Yeah.
Okay. A lot of them are changing that way. Sunday mornings, that's off the table. Wednesdays, for some reason, is still, because, with travel teams, I just did a family wedding in Virginia, and I was talking to my cousins who have all younger children. I'm the oldest, so my kids are out of the house. And they're like, oh, well, we have travel softball, we have travel soccer, all of these kind of things, and they're busy doing stuff on Sunday morning. Small towns is another. Several years ago, Greg wrote an article for it, and I did as well. It was published by the Fund for Theological Education, talking about the blessings of ministry in rural areas, especially out here in the plains. You know, a small town, lower cost of living. Our presbytery is a real big, I think I'll use Doodle as an example, and you can ask her, but Doodle has moved from mid-Kentucky presbytery to this presbytery, and she experienced her first presbytery meeting last weekend, and she was really surprised because we're very laid back. You know, her presbytery was very much very steeped in Book of Order, Robert's Rules of Order, and we're like, okay, we all love Jesus, we'll get along. You know, we've got folks on the left, folks on the right, but we're all going to try to work together and not get too caught up in all the polity and theology that we can get caught up into, which is rare. You know, I've been in presbyteries where you sit in a meeting determines your theology and your politics, who you hang out with. You know, the pastors who would stand up and speak to an issue and then their little ducks would follow behind them and comment on the same issue. You know, so we really try to stay away from that in our presbytery and just try to work together for God. But there are challenges to rural ministry, getting people to move to rural areas. Two of our most recent pastors, well, Eddie's been here for 5 years now. Eddie Mariel, who's the pastor in Lexington, at First Presbyterian, moved here from Los Angeles. Yes. And the house they first rented was across the street from a feedlot. Our pastor in Broken Bow moved here from Allentown, Pennsylvania around the same time. She had never heard of what a feedlot was. And she moved to Broken Bow, which has the largest one in the state. You know, and we had to tell her before she went to Broken Bow for the first time, don't comment about the smell. You know, just know that that's the livelihood of a lot of people in your congregation. So there are people willing to move here, and Eddie moved here. He has 3, now 4. They have a foster child they're adopting. 4 kids who were in middle school and high school, looking for a place to raise their kids. They also have a child who they adopted from Africa. So looking for a place where being a multicultural family would be accepted. And we found Eddie because I was working with my mentor as a new mid-council, a new EP. And he said, well, what's your biggest challenge in the presbytery? And I said, well, finding pastors to come to churches. He goes, yeah, I was talking to this guy who just graduating and was looking for a church, and they have, you know, mixed a multicultural family. And I said, have I got the church for him? And he moved. He took it. So, you know, Lexington is one of those rare communities where, I mean, the number of languages they speak in that high school is extraordinary. You know, if you're the average white, you know, Caucasian family, you are in the minority in that community. So some pastors tell me who are new in seminary, they say, well, I want to do social justice work. And I'm like, well, O'Neill, Nebraska, several years ago had one of the biggest ICE raids in the country at wasn't a tomato processing plant, I think, that they had that big ICE raid. And that church had to immediately meet the needs. Talk about social justice work. You know, you can find that. It's not just in a big city. Another challenge, financial challenges that we have in this area of people leaving the small towns and moving to big cities. I grew up in West Virginia, and there's so many similarities between West Virginia and Nebraska for that reason. With the decline of the coal industry and people leaving West Virginia, I have one cousin left in the state, really, except for some distant family. And we were just there. We drove to Virginia for the wedding. And, you know, it's the same. A lot of small towns. Some are experiencing some resurgence. Interestingly enough, one of the big signs that they have been finding for small communities coming back up is when a brewery shows up in town.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so you look around, a lot of these small towns like Ord has Scratchtown, you know, different, I could name off different, or wineries, I'm noticing. But that seems to be, Valentine has a new brewery there, but they're finding that leads to some of that. Because I think people are moving back to rural areas because of the lower cost of living, and then also a place to raise children as apart from other places. So now I just want to think out loud with you. So that's what I was told I could do, just to come up with my. So again, I've been in ministry for 30 years. I started seminary in 1989. It has changed. We're ordaining more women than we are men. When I started seminary, about a quarter of my class was women, and we had a lot of second career folk as well. And like I said, there were a lot of positions that you could walk right into an associate position and get your experience, which now there's a lot of, I liken it to some of these small churches really need to take on the role of being teaching congregations, of taking on a new pastor and help train them up. They're going to leave eventually, but if you can help train them up, it's like my first church that I was, right after seminary, I did a year as a chaplain at a pediatric hospital in Alabama. And I also helped fill in at a local church. And I had never moderated a session. And I had a clerk of session who'd been a clerk for like 30 years. And she taught me how to moderate a session. You don't learn that in seminary. You learn that from your church members. So, just these churches to realize, okay, it's a blessing. You're going to get somebody new. Their preaching may not be quite there yet. They're getting there, but with love and encouragement, and they'll love you back, you train them up. So I like to think of the church as the new neighborhood. I grew up on a circle with 9 houses on it. That was my world growing up in West Virginia. The town was about 4,000, and that was my neighborhood. I could walk into any house on that street and knew I would be safe, know that that those people would care for me like my family cared for me. We don't have that as much anymore. Our neighborhood, we've lived in it for 9 years now. And, we know a few neighbors, but not the way we knew my neighbors growing up. Now, granted, that's been 50 some years ago, which was a different world. But I don't know if we find that quite as much anymore with neighborhoods the way it used to be. So I think that the church can really become a new neighborhood for communities. So that means providing a myriad of activities, just like you all do here, of opening up, for music education or opening it up for community organizations to use the church. My mom talks about the way she learned about parenting was sitting around drinking coffee once the kids all went to school, and with the other ladies in the community who had raised kids. That's how she learned because she was young when she had me, and so to learn from these women who were 10, 15, 20 years older than she was, that's how she learned. So finding a place like that, finding a way that we can support one another in the church, regardless of theological or political ideologies, which have become so divisive for us, but to have that be our new neighborhood. Working with other denominations. Have you seen? I do that all the time. In fact, it's regularly that I get a phone call from one of the other judicatory leaders saying, hey, I've got a church here, who do you have available? In North Platte, Will Radcliffe, I don't know if Will Radcliffe moved here as a pastor, and then he had a brain tumor when he was a teenager and it recurred. So he had to, because of health, leave. And I called the assistant bishop who was works in North Platte and said, okay, I've got this church. And they had just had a PMA, which is like a commissioned pastor in the Lutheran church. And we put her right in there, and it's going great. So it's just being creative. I was on a call with other mid-council leaders this week, and somebody from the Presbytery of New York was like, well, we don't use commissioned pastors. And I'm sitting there going, we couldn't survive without commissioned pastors. And I think there's a real bias against commissioned pastors. And granted, it goes against the Presbyterian tradition of educated clergy. But that's also why our church didn't expand west like a lot of other churches did. Because it used to be the only seminary was Princeton. And so if you wanted a pastor to go out to Idaho or Montana or something, they had to train at Princeton and then go out. Whereas in the Methodist church, they sort of handed them a Bible and their book of discipline and gave them a horse and sent them out. So we just have to rethink about that and how we can use commission pastors in a way that still acknowledges the importance of educating our clergy, but still allowing for folks to come up within the congregation who don't follow the regular path. It's a lot like I think in medicine these days. My primary care provider is a nurse practitioner. Somebody else I know has a PA. I think that the medical out here has gotten that idea. Doesn't mean that there's not MDs who are still working with them, but you still have, I trust my nurse practitioner because she'll go, okay, this is beyond me. I'm going to send you to somebody else. So I think it's a lot of that same way with the church. Seminary training I've already touched on. Figuring out too how we do seminary training differently. Sharon Reese, who's the pastor in Minden, Sharon went to Dubuque Seminary, but she did their online program. It takes longer, but you still have a cohort that you are studying with, and you do go on campus. I think it's maybe twice a year for a couple weeks or something like that. She's a fantastic pastor. Second career, she was a nurse, a nursing home administrator, brings all those gifts and talents to the churches that she's in now. But she did it a little differently than me, who graduated from college, was out for not even a full year and went to seminary. That's rare these days to be ordained. Like I was ordained at 26. I can't believe they ordained me at 26, but that's rare these days. Part-time ministry, that's another area that's going to have to be, and that might be also tent making of, you're a part-time pastor in a church, and then you also have a job somewhere else. Luckily, with our Board of Pensions, which provides our pension and medical program, they now have it as if you're working 20 hours a week, you can get the medical program. So at least if you can get that, you can get someone in. So part-time ministry, I think, is going to become more so. So that's changing too, how seminary training is done, of helping pastors determine what could be their side job. Everybody talks about side hustles these days. What can be those side hustles? And I think it's also going to come along with clergy as well. Using media in creative ways. So this Sunday school class is an example, that we're streaming to folks right now. I hope there's some folks on here right now. Finding ways that we can use media. When everything shut down, the Presbyterian gave 1 year of Zoom to churches. We paid for at least 1 year. And we started providing a lot more grants for getting their media set up in the church. And I know this church has gotten funds from the Nebraska Presbyterian Foundation to help get those kind of things set up. So churches are having to learn new ways of doing church, but also ministers, you were talking about how Zoom was at the very beginning. It was just sort of pressing buttons. Now it's gotten some patience for you. So it's things that you have to learn. When I graduated, it was learning how to do a VCR. And then when we started using projectors, when you'd hook up your projector to your laptop, because when I started, it wasn't even laptops. It was still just a chunky, it's just a very different world of even the resources on the internet that we didn't have at the very beginning when I started in ministry. Some other examples of media is podcasts. Damon and Greg do a podcast already. If you listen to podcasts at all, you can get them on every topic there is. My husband is a huge Tolkien fanatic. So there's this new Rings of Power that's on Amazon. Right. So we've been listening to this podcast about Rings of Power, and things like that. So there are podcasts on everything to listen to. We found an adult podcast on parenting adult children, having a 24, almost 25-year-old and a 27-year-old, and the challenges that, Well, a lot of you understand parenting adult children. So, this organization called the Bible Project is fascinating. If you have a chance, they have really, they're out of, it's either Washington or Oregon. They have done an amazing job at using media and podcasts and YouTube to teach people about the Bible. Granted, it comes from a little bit more of a conservative viewpoint, not extremely. We're still talking about seminary trained, PhD level. One of the guys is a PhD level in like ancient languages, Aramaic and things like that. So they're still focusing on original language, cultural context, not getting caught up in cultural aspects of this civil kind of Christianity that I think is a part of our world right now. Really looking at what Scripture says and how, taking a book and going through that book. They also have done it a lot with drawings, and they're really focused a lot on folks that are the nuns, N-O-N-E-S. Have you heard the nuns? These are people that have no religious background. The nuns, you may hear that in some of the weeks that, the next couple of conversations you all have. Looking at folks, so the guy that teaches it, leads it, his best friend growing up, they met in like a skateboard park and they skateboarded together. And they both came, I think that's how they eventually joined a church. I don't know all the details. And they sit and have these conversations with this guy with a PhD and this guy that doesn't, and he asks questions of like, well, hey, what does this mean? They bring in professors and things from other seminaries, other organizations to talk. It's fascinating. It really is. I heard about it through my mom through the lockdown. My mother is the Enneagram, she's a 5. So she has to soak up every bit of information that there is. My mother's a real Bible scholar. I think if she had been born a little bit later, she would have ended up with like a PhD in biblical studies or something. She's fascinated by it because how they teach and what they teach. And she said, I'm always listening for it, thinking there's got to be something. She said, I haven't found anything that's really, made her think, but just that they really focus on Scripture. Also, there is a church in Milwaukee that is totally virtual, which that's a new thing. Now, their pastor is getting older, so they're wondering how that's going to be. So there's another example of using media in different ways. A virtual church. So it's now starting to think about, okay, what is membership? Because you could have somebody who watches every Sunday, participates in Sunday school, that lives in California, that is still a part of this congregation. So what does that mean for membership and church participation? So that's all I had on that. I've talked for a really long time, but I want to see if you have any questions or any comments about any of that I've spoken about. You must be a 5. Is that what you said? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a 5.
Yeah.
I was just thinking about calling out Dan for a second here, if he doesn't mind, but we're part of a Bible group.
Yeah.
And it's
Right.
an example. Can you give a little example of how that's
Oh,
grown?
yeah, how we're using media. Maybe you already know about it, but I do a book study.
Uh-huh.
And it really started many years ago, but then when COVID came along, we couldn't get together.
Mm-hmm.
So we still do it, but we do it on Zoom.
Oh.
And so I try to make it like a college or a seminary class and put PowerPoints together and things like that. We have good conversations. The people in there are all intellectually advanced and astute. Would you say, Dwight? Dwight's in there, Sharon's in there, some college professors that I used to teach with. And we just go from one book to another.
That's great.
We're reading John Shelby Spong's The Fourth Gospel, Tales of a Jewish Mystic right now. We had just come from reading his text on Matthew, actually it's called Biblical Literalism, a Gentile Heresy. But and I think it goes pretty well because sometimes we have somebody's from like in Arizona or Colorado, you know, people could join us from any part of the world, really, if, you know, if they just were up at the, you know, like David McCarthy wants to join, but it would be him having to join like at 10 o'clock at night.
Oh, yeah.
You know, things like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
And so, but I think it goes pretty well, you know.
And it speaks to one of the things we talk a lot about is this group met very early in the morning for coffee before they went to work
Mhm.
for many, many years. So every once in a
And
while,
I'm so
Dan will
glad.
say, what connects us as people though, when we're not talking about Spong's book or another topic? In other words, what brings us together? And I think one of the things we try consciously to do is connect with each other before we start talking about the topic. In other words, catch up. How is
Yeah.
everybody doing? Because that was part of why being there in person, like we are today,
Mhm.
is valuable. And I'd like to have you talk about just a little bit about how do we reconnect in person? Because you started with, you know, meeting somebody skateboarding.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's in person.
Mhm.
But it's real easy now to meet people that we never ever see in
Oh, yeah.
person.
Yeah.
And I think that has its own set of concerns and joys, I think.
I wish I had great answers for that, because it's a matter of trying to, you know, when we locked down, you know, it just changed the way everything was done, and we suddenly were looking for, you know, getting permission that we could do communion virtually, you know, those kind of things. And then how to bring everybody back. I don't know how it's going to happen, and what the great answer is. In some ways, I really would like it to be for things like these kind of studies, you know, to come and talk. I think right now we're so caught up, especially social media, about throwing out all these kinds of things, but we don't have a place where we can get together and just talk, where we may disagree. I miss that. I miss that big tent nature of the church, you know, where we have conservative, liberal, moderate, everything in the midst. I don't know what's going to bring people back. I think that's the great question of what we're going to do. And I think it's relationships of trying to build. And that's what it was before, of bringing people to church. It wasn't the minister that caused somebody to come to church. You know, most of the studies that have been done, like by Barna and Pew Research, those kind of things, it's like 80%, the reason they would come is because someone asked them.
Right.
You know, it's not because they come and hear preaching. Ministers would like to think of that, but, you know, ministers come and go. It's church members who are the ones that are here, you know, continuing things, you know, year after year, day after, those kind of things. So finding a place where people can talk. I would love to have it be of really getting back to studying the biblical text, to not what it's been perverted to be.
Yeah.
That seems like a strange word, but I think in many ways it has been, and not, you know, really looking, okay, what did Jesus really say about these things? That's why, and I'd be interested for you to look at the Bible Project and tell me what you think.
Oh, yeah, I'm going to as soon as I go home.
Because they really do. I mean, they had somebody they had a professor. Hebrews is one of my favorite books of the Bible. And they had a professor from Wheaton College come in, and she is a professor on Hebrews talking about that. And it was fascinating to listen to it. And I wouldn't have necessarily heard somebody from Wheaton, you know, because I wasn't trained, you know, that's comes under more of an evangelical kind of side of theology. But I would hope that it would be trying to introduce people to what Scripture really is. I don't know. And that's going to be finding ways of doing that are not normal ways. It's meeting people in a skate park. You know, it's funny because we passed a church years ago. I wanted our church to put in a skate park because I was the head of family ministries at the time, associate, and my church wouldn't have anything to do with it. Now I see churches are doing it. You know, I just thought, come on, this would be a great way to reach out, especially to young boys. You know, just think what we could do of reaching out to young boys and girls too, but to, you know, in a different way with a skate park. Kids that are, you know, they were already skating all around the church because there were stairs and all kinds of things to do tricks on. So I'm talking in circles, but go ahead.
I do have something I'd like you to think about, and that is something that the Presbyterian Church is not known for is kind of a contemplative tradition. And then what we've been experiencing, at least in our today service, I think when we started, there were like 1 or 2 people that show up. Well, this morning, you almost couldn't get a seat.
Really?
So something's happening there, and it's not a true today service because we have a sermon in the middle of it and we have announcements and all that. It's like, please don't do that. But there is something that is attracting people,
Yeah.
right? And I kind of wonder if people just want to be together without having all
Yeah.
kinds of words going on, and that's what I saw this morning, and it's been growing kind of gradually. So I don't know, it's just one thing that I'm really glad that we have here.
Yeah. Well, and along with that, I was reading not too long ago about one of the denominations that was growing, one of the areas is the Orthodox tradition.
Right?
That it's growing, I think, for a lot of that same thing, we think of the smells and bells is what they call it, the incense, but I think it's that multi-sensory aspect of worship, more contemplative, more just acknowledging that spiritual side of ourselves that we don't get to because we're inundated with words, and sounds, and there's very little silence. So I think.
I mean, are we open to introducing smells and bells? Because frankly, I'm a papist when it comes to it. It comes right down to it. I love the liturgy. I love, everything that goes with it. The icons, the sometimes the chanting and everything. I'm not a papist.
I know that.
But that feeds my soul,
Mhm.
and I just wonder if that's something that we can introduce into our churches these days.
I think it can. I think, the Presbyterian Church and Reformed tradition was so against any kind of iconography or anything.
Right.
But the executive presbyter in the Missouri Union Presbyterian, she paints icons and has studied with some of the big painters and famous painters of icons. And so so I think there are all kinds of ways that we can draw that in. I've taught a class on Anglican prayer beads, of using prayer beads like a rosary, but it's not a rosary. It's, it guides you through like the Lord's Prayer and some other things like that. I think that's what we can do is, we can always be reforming and always adding into our tradition, but not becoming, I think, so caught up in one way of doing things. That there's all different ways of experiencing God. Yeah.
Question for you.
Yes.
We've kind of talked a lot about guidance for the church and what that looks like. Can you touch on a little bit what you're seeing in other churches? I think one of the real strengths of our church is our children and youth
Yes.
activities and vibrant Sunday school, Wednesday programs, and dedicated people associated with those types of programs. Can you talk a little bit about what you're seeing in other churches as it relates to children and youth activities?
I'm seeing that there are churches that are doing that, especially in communities that I know Grand Island, that's what the new associate pastor they're bringing in is really to focus on youth and children's ministries, is my understanding. So you see a mix. But I know that there's a church.
Benkelman probably less so.
Benkelman less so. There's no children in that church. But there are some communities like, I know I've talked to churches that don't have many youth in their church. I said, okay, why can't you be the empty nest church? Why can't you be the church that has disposable income because your children are raised and you can really reach out to your community? Why not be a church that you gather to care for your community and find ways to do that? So I think it's really, yes, we want to draw in that next generation. We have to. But we also, unfortunately, I think in the Presbyterian Church, we tilt more towards a little bit older. And I think that's because you have to almost be a bigger church to have a children's choir or a children's bell choir or a youth program, that kind of thing. But that's also where communities fit into. I know in Valentine, they do a Logos program. You're familiar with Logos? It's been around for years, midweek. So they do it with the Methodist Church, the Presbyterian Church up there. And so they'll take one part of the age group and the Methodist Church takes the other. So again, maybe that's trying to find a way in small towns of sharing one person. The same comes with music. When I was in Lexington, we had this beautiful organ. I was the interim there for 2 years. And we didn't get it played every Sunday because we had an organist we shared with 2 other churches. So, some of it comes down to size, budget, staffing, those kind of things.
We've talked about this before, but I grew up in Lexington, for those of you who didn't know, and I was Lutheran when I was growing up, and so our Lutheran church and the Presbyterian church always partnered every summer and offered Vacation Bible School.
They still do.
Together.
Yeah.
And so that was how I was kind of first introduced to Presbyterian.
Yeah.
And that beautiful church.
Yeah, it is a gorgeous church, especially at Christmas. It's just
It is
stunning.
How
beautiful.
is the pastor doing there? Like Ed is his name?
In Eddie, in Lexington,
Yeah, how's he settling in?
he's doing great. Yeah, they're doing great, I think, of course, there's challenges. He started right, in 2017
Oh, boy.
and then, everything happens but yeah, he's doing, really well. So, and they've, I think are committed to raising their kids there, and his parents are just moving there from California
Wow.
because his mom wants to be a grandma, close by.
Yeah.
So yeah. I really, my work, I'm part-time, so I get so focused on just trying to fill churches and those kind of things that I don't get too much into, youth and children's ministry anymore, where that's what I did for years, was youth and children's family ministries, those kind of things. Anybody else have any comments or questions or?
I was thinking about talking about these people coming back, and I just kind of on the fence with that because there was such a big concern and worry that we're going to lose these people. But luckily, this church, we were with the Zoom just before COVID, we were set up.
Yeah.
And it was great. But even in those times, we worried, are we going to falter there because people aren't coming to church?
Right.
And it kind of goes back to your other slide where it talked about church being central in people's lives. And it's amazing to me how many people consider that to be, although they don't come to church. And frankly, those people, now that they can watch this online, they can watch today's service online, I think their faith is probably growing. And even though they're not in community with us, I think their families and their friendships might be beneficial to that end.
Oh, yeah, I don't deny that. I think that, yes, there were challenges that came with that, but I think there's also many blessings that came with Zoom. For pastors to look and see that somebody from another country has logged in to listen to their worship service, and participate. That's pretty amazing.
Yes.
And I really think, I've prayed it so many times to thanking God for the technology that has bridged the miles. I mean, I look at the Presbytery, that's how we had meetings for a long time. That's how before COVID, we were doing meetings by Zoom anyway. I just wish I'd taken out stock in Zoom before that. But I think that there are many things that could be open, just like that virtual church in Milwaukee. I think it's also a matter of trying to figure out how we care, especially for those folks that can't leave the home, how churches can help them access that. Whether that's getting a grant to buy a bunch of iPads and then have your youth group go out and train some of the older folks in your church how to use the iPad and get a hotspot or something. My husband is a public library director, and there's a discussion in public libraries as do they lend out hotspots so that people without internet can take one out of the library and have access to internet, at their home. So hopefully with some of the infrastructure things that are happening, broadband is going to be a little bit more widely available to folks. But yeah, I think there are good things. And we have in this country, I think we have this false idea about what church numbers should be. Right after the war, World War II, we had that huge growth of churches. And that was happening even before then. But, at the time, my grandfather worked for Marathon Oil Company in Findlay, Ohio. He was expected as a middle manager to go to church. He had grown up Presbyterian, baptized, confirmed, everything Presbyterian. And because the president and some of the other senior VPs went to the Presbyterian church, he didn't want to go there, so he became Methodist. But he was expected to be in church on Sunday. That's where you made your business contacts. That was not, I think that's a real false understanding that that's how we think, oh, why can't we go back to the 50s, the 60s, those kind of things. It was an expectation. But if you look at the way church was before that, the numbers, and I have those numbers, I should have brought them, but of what some of the studies have been about, like 1 in 6 or 1 in 8 even of people that did participate in church before that, it wasn't as, I think we're going back to almost the way it always has been with that little bit of a bubble. However, we know that during that time, hospitals were funded, schools, universities were funded, those kind of things happened during that big growth. But unfortunately, we've got all these big buildings now, and how do we figure out ways to use them? And when people are going to be attending online or those kind of things. So, yeah.
I go way back to the 1950s, and we had to go to chapel 3 times a week in college.
Oh, yeah.
And one of them was always a worship service. And we had to fill out a little card, say, I attended such and such a church on Sunday. And of course, there was lots of lying encouraged.
The true biblical way.
And I doubt that Hastings College has a requirement for chapel any longer.
No,
Yeah.
they don't even have a chapel program, I don't think anymore, do they?
Well, I know they have chapel on Wednesdays, don't they?
Yeah, maybe they do, yeah.
They do.
Exactly.
There were a couple of years where it was certainly minimal, but
Yeah.
what was
Doodle.
Chaplain Doodle
Yeah.
back there working to build that.
Yeah. I went to a Big Ten university, so it was sort of like church. Most everybody on campus, professors were like, so anyway. Yeah. Anybody else?
Phil, could you say just a little bit about Synod School? I'm
Oh,
not sure anybody in the group that we have 2 more
Right.
sessions. Greg's going to talk a little bit about probably more local things, but maybe international.
maybe.
He hasn't given me his agenda yet,
Yeah.
for next week. And then, is it Shelby?
Shelley
Shelley
Latham.
Latham is coming from Omaha. She's with the foundation.
Yeah, she's with the Omaha Presbyterian Seminary Foundation. In fact, she was here and preached, wasn't it Labor Day?
Memorial Day.
Memorial Day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Somewhere
Not
around there.
long ago, yeah.
Yeah, it was great to her happily here, but I don't know who's going to talk about Synod and Synod School.
I can talk about Synod School. I've never been.
I was
Like I
gonna say,
mentioned, our synod is one of the few synods that still has a synod school. It happens in July, and it's at Buena Vista College in Iowa.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful, from what I understand, a great week of bringing in a preacher and a speaker, but then there's all kinds of activities. There's tie-dyeing, there's cooking outside. I always see the pictures from them learning how to cook outside with like Dutch ovens, on the outside cooking. There's so many things there. And a lot of people come as families. They have gone to that as their vacation for years and years. Have any of you been to?
I've taught a course
Have
a
you?
couple of summers.
Yeah.
I'm an English teacher, and I teach especially the literature before the Reformation.
Oh,
And so I'm immersed in Christian theology and things like that in order to read the literature.
so you'll have courses like that, and then you'll have tie-dyeing
Yeah.
and activities for children. And they also are now doing training for commissioned pastors at that time. Bringing into people talk about preaching or polity or theology, those kind of things. So,
well, thank you.
yeah.
Because as we figure out, where we connect to have conversations about
Yeah.
what's important to us, it's nice to know that there are plenty of other options for us to make
Well,
those connections and then come back to our congregation.
Yes.
Yeah.
And we're really trying to change Presbytery too. So at our past 2 Presbytery meetings, we are no longer meeting in the sanctuary. We're meeting in fellowship halls around tables and talking to one another. We have worship in the sanctuary, and then we move so we can have conversation. We're doing it in October and April now. There's not going to be a summer meeting because it just messes up with, and then there'll be a January Zoom meeting. So 2 meetings. So we're only apart from each other for 6 months. So to try to bring in different things. I know this past one, I talked a lot about there's some great videos out there about per capita and about the organization of the agencies in the church. So I did some education about that. So yeah.
How long is your role? Are you appointed, hired?
So I'm not called, some positions are called and installed, but they've done mine on like a 3-year cycle.
Uh-huh.
So I'm in the midst of my second 3-year cycle as EP. And I think it's going to continue as long as we can find funding, and make sure that we're okay funding wise. When Bob Hauser was here, the previous full-time EP, after that, we had an a transitional person who came in and came up with a new staffing model. It was going to cost more than Bob had cost, and so we changed that after he left. And it came up with doing my position part-time, 20 hours as EP and 10 as lady clerk, and then our office person is less than 20 hours a week. So we've really cut down our office, compared to a lot of presbyteries. We were early in the game on that, but I think we're going to have to start to have conversation with Homestead and Missouri River Valley about how do we look at presbytery for the state. My concern is that Omaha and Lincoln don't think about us out here. They think Western Nebraska is Grand Island.
That's just not about Presbyterian.
Oh, it's everything, yeah.
Okay.
It takes longer to get from Lincoln to Kearney than it does from Kearney to Lincoln, kind of stuff, which is I live in Kearney. So we're gonna have to do something with that. I don't know when it's gonna happen, how. So, yeah. I love my job. I really do. I just have, I've always done work with the presbytery, but it just was really, I felt like it was a Esther moment that for such a time as this kind of thing, when this position opened and I got it. Because after being in the parish for so long, to then look at ways of helping churches and pastors, I really enjoy it.
I know I mentioned it at the beginning. I was on session when we went through our pastor search for Greg, and just our work together. You were just invaluable for us in kind of helping the session at that time kind of work through that process, and so it was really wonderful to have some sort of outside but local expert who could guide the session during that time, and so it was really, really helpful.
And I would add to that, thank you for coming this morning.
Oh, absolutely.
We're very happy that you're gonna stay for worship.
Oh, yeah.
Greg says he's got a whole bunch of things going on.
Yeah.
He only has an hour, so I don't know.
Oh, yeah, who knows?
And then later today, we have a congregational meal. We're getting together, and then we're gonna hear a little bit about the history of our church.
Oh, wonderful.
And I hear there's gonna be some folks impersonating other people.
Oh, really?
What it would have liked to have been back then. So, that could be kind of interesting and dramatic as well.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Can we just have a word of prayer before we part?
absolutely. Would you like me to lead that, or do you want
If you
to?
would like to. that'd be
Okay,
fine.
I will. Most gracious and loving God, we give you thanks for this day, for the opportunity to gather in this place, and also thankful for the folks who can gather through the wonderful gifts of technology that bring us together across the miles to be with one another in new ways. We thank you, God, for always guiding your church, for continuing to help us find new ways of reaching out to those around us who may have stepped away for a while or have never been a part of a congregation. Help us, God, to find ways to reach out to them and draw them back. Give us new ways to worship you, to experience you in new ways. Be with us as we leave this room now and go to gather in worship, for that privilege of lifting our voices together in praise. And we pray that you will bring us back together again in your name. Amen.